Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2018 Mason Conversation, brought to you by the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law and the UNSW Faculty of Law. My name's Sean Brennan and I'm the Director of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight and a very warm welcome to you all. I begin by acknowledging we're on the traditional lands of Aboriginal people today. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Bidjigal people and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the lands on which the Sydney campuses of the University of New South Wales are located. And I pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us tonight. Tonight's the second in a series of events that was inaugurated in 2016. Back then, we featured a conversation with Sir Anthony Mason, the person in whose honour this series is named. I take this opportunity to acknowledge Sir Anthony and to welcome him, his daughter-in-law Catherine and his grandson Robert to tonight's event. Sir Anthony is, as you know, one of the giants of Australian law, following a career as a barrister, Solicitor General for the Commonwealth and Judge of Appeal in New South Wales. He was appointed as a Judge of the High Court of Australia in 1972. And he was Chief Justice of the Court during a landmark period in its history, from 1987 until his retirement in 1995. After his retirement from the High Court, Sir Anthony was a non-permanent judge of the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal from 1997 to 2015. And here at UNSW, of course, Sir Anthony was the 5th Chancellor of the university between 1994 and 1999. Closer to home for us, he was the inaugural chair of the Gilbert and Tobin Centre's Advisory Committee, and he provided invaluable support and advice to me and my predecessors as directors of the centre. But particularly striking to me is the remarkable support he's continuously shown to the young and emerging scholars in our public law community. As a donor of scholarships, through meeting with students individually and regularly attending and participating in our conferences and workshops. We're so incredibly fortunate to have a world-famous legal authority who is such a generous contributor to our community and particularly the development of our emerging scholars. So thank you again, Sir Anthony, for everything you've done for this university and this law school. And it's an honour again to host you in a somewhat less demanding role than in 2016 at the Mason Conversation. I'm delighted to see so many new faces here for us at the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law. Our featured guests tonight have attracted people from many different sectors, often well beyond the legal community with which we more regularly engage. And it's terrific to have you all here. For those of you who are less familiar with the Centre, it was established in 2001 and it's been supported ever since by a generous annual donation to the university from the law firm Gilbert and Tobin. I want to acknowledge the managing partner of the firm, Danny Gilbert. He's a tireless supporter of social justice in Australia, in visible and frequently in behind-the-scenes ways, and he's got a particular commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their aspirations for a fairer deal in Australia. He had a long-standing prior engagement tonight, but I want to register our thanks to him and the firm for what is approaching now 2 decades of highly valued support to our centre. And I do acknowledge the 2 partners here from Gilbert and Tobin, Dr. Kate Harrison and Ms Anne Cregan, who are with us tonight. Through the Centre, we regularly provide a platform where people can hear and engage with great speakers, reflecting on important issues from history, from our present and for our future, through the lens of public law. This, however, is a special event for us that departs from our normal format. It's a conversation that allows us to gain an insight into a prominent figure in Australian society and the issues of public law with which they're associated. Our onstage compere takes them through the milestones and influences in their personal and professional lives before we expand the dialogue to include questions from the audience. I'm absolutely delighted that tonight we get a 200% return on that idea by featuring not one, but two fabulous women who know each other well. They come from different backgrounds and different generations, but in recent times, they've worked very closely together on a historic process of consultation and deliberation amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I'm very pleased to say that with the assistance of Megan and Pat tonight, we have the original Uluru Statement from the Heart on display here on stage. Before formally introducing Pat and Megan to you, I want to introduce their partner in conversation for the first part of tonight's event. Professor George Williams, AO, is of course a Professor of Law here at UNSW and was the foundation director of our centre from its inception in 2001 until 2008. And as well as a leading national and international public law scholar, George is a prominent media commentator and has a regular column in The Australian. He's written and edited a remarkable 35 books, appeared as a barrister in the High Court of Australia and overseas courts, and he's conducted or participated in numerous public policy processes. Since June 2016, George has also been our Dean and led the law school through a period of rapid growth and change, and I'm delighted and grateful that he was available to conduct the onstage conversation tonight. And now to our two guests on stage. I'm delighted that we managed to bring Pat and Megan together for this conversation, two people I've now known and admired for a long time. Along with my UNSW colleagues, Gabrielle Appleby and Gemma McKinnon, I saw at close quarters the monumental feat of leadership these two women together displayed in the period culminating at Uluru in May last year. Taking a carefully designed but very ambitious deliberative process on the road, region by region, around Australia, asking busy people facing enormous challenges in their ordinary working lives to set aside days and to tackle complex questions of constitutional and structural reform, and to try and find a consensus on the reforms that people need so desperately. And then to take these regional outcomes up a step to a national level. That was a historic undertaking, and it required intellectual leadership, patience, and persistence against what often seemed improbable odds. You'll find out tonight why, with Pat and Megan's leadership, that all proved possible in the end. Both of them will talk about their background and professional lives, but I'll just give you a very brief biographical sketch of some of the highlights as an introduction to the conversation. Pat Anderson, AO, is an Alyara woman who grew up in Darwin. Following work and travel in different parts of Australia and overseas in 1980, she became one of the first Aboriginal women to graduate from the University of Western Australia. After working in southern states on education, she returned to the Northern Territory as CEO of Danila Aboriginal Health Service, later becoming the chair of key organisations in the community-controlled health sector and in health research, including since 2010, chair of the Lowacha Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Research. Pat's published many papers and articles and is particularly well known for co-authoring with Rex Wild QC the Little Children Are Sacred report in 2007. She was, of course, co-chair of the Referendum Council, which handed down its report to the Federal Parliament on 30 June 2017. Her contributions in health, education, law reform and social justice have been recognised with many awards, including the National Human Rights Medal in 2016, honorary doctorates from 2 universities, and in 2014, an Order of Australia. Just last month, she was presented with the 2018 NAIDOC Lifetime Achievement Award. Professor Megan Davis is a Cobble woman who grew up in country and coastal parts of southern Queensland. She studied arts and law at the University of Queensland and as a young lawyer worked at ATSIC and the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She first worked at UNSW at the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law in 2001 and subsequently became Director of the Indigenous Law Centre and in 2017, UNSW's first Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous. She was the first Aboriginal Australian elected to United Nations body, and more recently has been a member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She was also, of course, a member of the Prime Minister's expert panel on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and of the Prime Minister's Referendum Council, having a lead role in the design and implementation of the regional dialogues culminating at Uluru. As importantly as anything else, Megan is a rugby league fanatic and was appointed as a commissioner of the sports governing body in 2017.
That should get a clap.
She too has received media, professional and educational awards, too numerous to mention tonight, but needless to say, we're very proud that in all that Megan is not only a Pro Vice-Chancellor at this university, but remains a professor here in the law faculty. I ask you to join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor George Williams, and our special guests in conversation, Ms Pat Anderson, AO, and Professor Megan Davis.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. Pat, can we start by going right back? You grew up with your family in the Parup camp, which is now the suburb of Stewart Park in Darwin. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what it was like to grow up in that place and how that influenced the sort of person and things that you have advocated for?
From this distance, I'm just beginning to truly understand the profound influences that shaped me growing up in Parup camp. In those days, because I'm sort of double figures now and have been for some time, that was when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were forced to live on the edges of towns, and there was a terminology called fringe dwellers. Well, Parup camp was one of those places. We couldn't live in Darwin except in certain places. Parup camp was one of many camps. There was one at Winnelly and a place called Nycliffe and what have you. So we all lived there together, and at the time I thought we were very happy because it was a very closed community. We were dirt poor, a closed, intolerant community, but nevertheless with a strong sense of what was right and what was wrong. And many of the policies today, like for instance, I grew up in a household where neither parent spoke English. My mother was part of the stolen generations, but we're one of the lucky families because she was a little bit older and she always knew where she came from. So we've returned several times. So we were sort of lucky. And the other thing that we were fortunate about, I think, was the fact that our dad actually was part of the family. And in those days at Parup camp, there were mothers and fathers and families in the more traditional sense. I don't remember one family, what they call now a single parent family. So in hindsight, that was a very rich growing up, and this strong sense of social justice and what was right. There were so many things that we couldn't do then. There were so many names that we were called, half caste, quarter caste, quadroon, whole different language now that is, it's changed, but subject to systemic racism at every twist and turn. And we were really, really poor and lots of health conditions and what have you. But people fought for social justice and for rights, my family and many other families, because they needed for things to change. And they did over time. But I do remember, and I'm old enough to remember, when the precursor to family allowance was called child endowment. And in those days, because my mother was under the welfare, under the protection it was called, of the Superintendent of Native Welfare, she would have to go every month and explain to him how she was going to spend that money. And then he would decide whether she would get the full amount or portion of. And there's a whole lot of literature, a whole lot of files and files about my dad and my family complaining and forcing the government to change that. So when Jenny Macklin a few years ago came up with this family support, this income management plan, I thought, hello, we've done this before. And it didn't work then, and a whole generation of people fought for it to be changed. So lots of things happened. There were different organisations sort of formed, very strong union connection. And we listened to the radio. We remember the foundation of the Aboriginal Advancement League in Victoria, including what was happening in America with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and they were all influences. So there was a lot of time of, when I was sort of growing up, there was a time of a lot of change, but the foundation work of being very clear on what was right and what was wrong and we deserve better was a very strong influence on me and all the families in Darwin at that particular time. And now many of them have gone off and done lots of great things.
And Pat, when you were a young person seeing those things and forming a sense of social justice, did you have a sense at that point of right and wrong and
I did.
And feeling, you know, a desire to bring change because of what you were seeing at that time?
I did. I knew that you guys had the power and you had knowledge, and I would really, really wanted to go to school so I could learn everything and be able to participate and properly present our ideas. So I was chomping at the bit to go to school because I knew that there was a bit missing here. And my parents too. You know, in those days, school wasn't negotiable like it is now. You went to school. I don't understand this, you know, kids not wanting to go to school. We have a terrible situation in the Northern Territory. We have a couple of generations who today are unable to read and write, and I just think that's criminal because it's so changed. So school was really important to me because I wanted to get started on this life that I knew was there waiting for me. I was very conscious of that.
And when you talked about the importance of an education, did you see university as being part of that journey at that point?
I did, but living in prep camp and who we were, it was like asking you to go to the moon. It was just completely out of the question. But the other thing too, and I remember going to the first day at school, before I went there, I decided that I was going to learn everything I possibly could because my mother, one of the public policy of the day was in fact not to teach her to read and write. So I thought I was going to go to school and learn everything that I needed to learn. So when I would come home every day and I'd sit down and I would show her what I'd learnt that day, so my thinking was that I'd pay really extra attention so I could come home and teach my mother to read and write.
And did that work?
She did sit down with me a couple of times, but of course I didn't know anything about adult learning. I just thought, you know, I'll just be really good and learn as much as I can, and then we would sit down and I would be able to teach her. But it didn't happen. I couldn't do it. But that was my main purpose of wanting to go to school, was to learn knowledge but be able to come home and teach my mother so she could learn as I was learning.
And Megan, you grew up in different circumstances, some time later in a big family of brothers and sisters in southern Queensland, and your dad worked on the railways, but after your parents separated, your mum raised you and your siblings in, again, very modest circumstances. You talked a bit about the sort of values you got from that time, but again, can you give us a sense of what it was like growing up in that sort of family and what sort of influence that had on you?
Yeah, I suppose when we were living, so my family come from the Cherbourg Reserve and had left there round about the same period that everybody was able to leave reserves and missions. And so my family ended up in Hervey Bay. And then prior to that, a bit after that, my dad met my mum, and he obviously worked in Queensland Rail. So we moved around a lot around North Burnett, so southwest Queensland. And we were a pretty tight family, but a very big family.
So how many brothers and sisters did you have?
I've got 4 brothers and 1 sister. I should know that. But my dad had like 11 brothers and sisters, and I mean, we just have a huge Davis family.
Look, I'm from Tasmania. Mine's about the same size, but...
Yours is the whole island. Sorry, that was a bad joke. Sorry, George.
It's really bad.
And so what was it like, Megan, growing up in the family and moving around? What sense did you have about the need for an education yourself at that time?
So when we left Dad, we grew up in Eagleby in a housing commission home in southeast Queensland. And we were there and Mum's still there, so that's where I did most of my secondary schooling and that is high school. Sorry, I'm really unnerved myself now. and the University of Queensland. But so in terms of the kinds of values, so we were a very tight family. Obviously, we were away from country and away from our family at that point. So we became very, tight as a group. My mum was an English teacher. Although because we were living where we were living, she didn't teach during that period. She ran the house like a military operation, so she was always there, always at home, always supervising homework. So I don't know, I had a chat to her about this actually, about, we always think what it was. I mean, I can't remember, we were very poor too. And Auntie Pat, I know I've said this to you before, but when I came to Sydney, like everybody says they were poor. Like everywhere you go, people are like, yeah, we were poor too. And it's like, they had a car and owned their own home and, that kind of relative poverty. We were really, really poor. And, I was saying to James on the way here, if you haven't eaten porridge biscuits for lunch, because Mum can't afford any ingredients and uses the leftover porridge, throws a bit of flour and throws it in the oven. And I mean, we really struggled.
Well, and that was particularly when your parents separated too, I
imagine. Yeah, we really struggled.
How old were you then when your mother started to bring you up by herself?
Probably, George, really, 8, 9, 10. That's a massive difference between ages there. But I honestly, I can't remember. It was about grade 6. But the thing is, I don't remember. I know that we were poor. I can see that now looking back on it, but I don't remember being poor at the time. I was very happy, and my siblings are the same. I think a big part of our, I suppose, successes as kids in that family with Mum is, again, reading and school. So the whole house revolved around going to school and sport. Mum would not let us watch television. So she was very big on the ritual of eating breakfast together, like all of us at the table, having conversations and discussions about any of the topics that, we were studying at school, from World War I to Vietnam to World War II. The same with dinner. We'd come home, we'd all talk about, we had to sit in the lounge room and talk about what we'd learned and what we'd done at school. Then we'd play, and then we'd do our homework, and then again you'd have dinner and talk about, current affairs and...
And talking about current affairs, did you have any sense growing up of, racism, segregation, any sense that you were being treated differently or unfairly as a child?
Yeah, well, because my grandfather and our family had come from Warra and had been removed to a reserve, that's a big part of your identity, I suppose, being Aboriginal in Queensland. I also grew up during the Bjelke-Petersen era, so you had a very keen sense then of not only the discriminatory treatment towards Aboriginal people, but also just generally the Queensland population in terms of fundamental civil and political rights. So, a lot of Queensland Aboriginal leaders often laugh about how many Queensland Aboriginal leaders there are, and that a big part of that is, I wouldn't say Joe's influence, but Joe's influence. What? Yeah, his legacy. So, I think one of the biggest values, I suppose, was that of routine, sticking to a routine, and a big, another huge value, of course, is education and always learning. We read everything. We were prolific readers. And with the little bit of money that she did have, she spent it on, so we always had a Time America subscription. We always had a subscription to the Australian newspaper. But the bulk of any leftover money was spent on secondhand books, which we hated at the time because she'd come home with, plastic bags full of books. But I realise now what she was trying to do in terms of engendering a culture of reading.
And you both talked a lot about education and the importance of that to your family life. Pat, were there any particular teachers or people who made a real difference to you in the education you had in high school or university?
I think in grade 7, because you have so many different education systems, grade 7 is still in the primary school. I was really struggling with maths. I was always good with words and I was good with that. But I was struggling with maths and I needed to pass. I needed a maths pass to go to high school. And there was Miss Bowie. She worked on me the whole year to make sure that I would pass. And it was an odd number. The highest score was 110. And she worked so hard, she really did, but I actually got 108. so I was very pleased with myself, and so was she, I think. We weren't sure that we could actually do this. So that was a fairly, only a little milestone, but it did help me. I couldn't have got to high school if I hadn't had Miss Bowie. So she was determined. I enjoyed university. I took the circuitous route. I didn't do what Megan did, went to school and did. At 15, I decided that, because I asked my parents, I want to go to university. They said, it's out of the question, forget it. So I thought, I'm just wasting my time here at school. So I left, just walked out of school. And they were very upset, very cranky, but I thought my dad would send me back to school, but he took me at my word and said, okay, you now owe your mother board and you better get a job. So that's how I thought to myself, I really was hoping he would say, get back to school, and he didn't. And I was really stumped then, but I was so full of pride that I didn't want to back down. So I thought, yeah, I can do that. I'll just go and get a job, Lucky for me, the public service in Darwin was then called the NT Administration. They were running courses to teach only women in those days, young women, to be stenographers. No one knows what a stenographer is, but it's a short person that writes shorthand and types on an Olivetti. And it turned out I was quite good at that. So that's how I actually started my working life. And from then it actually led me to the Woodward Royal Commission, because all the evidence was taken by people like me, shorthand. So I travelled all around doing that. Once I did go to university as a mature age student, but because I'm so vain, I didn't set the mature age. I could just do too well at two subjects. I took the 5 and competed at the tertiary admittance examination, which they used to be called then, and I got my first choice, which to go to the University of Western Australia. Because I had so many gaps, there was not a lot that I could do, so of course I did the social sciences, and I'm very grateful I did, because I'm a literature major, but what the study of literature did includes anthropology and sociology and history and everything. It really is the study of the history of ideas. And that's been very, very, very useful to me in everything that I've done since. So I'm very grateful for that, for the University of Western Australia, for the time that I've spent with them. I think I'm the 3rd Aboriginal graduate ever from the University of Western Australia. There were just 2 before me, and then there's me. And we all know each other, although one of them's gone now.
I think Sean's just going to show us a bit of a clip before we move on.
It's really important that you inform yourself. I'm of the generation where we fought tooth and nail. We hardly had any of us who'd completed year 12. In fact, I left school at 15. My mother was not educated at all, never went to school. She was very smart. But it was a policy of the day that she, in fact, not go to school, that she not be educated, that she not learn these new ways. So we've come a really long way, and for you to stand up there as a school captain, it's very reaffirming, and we're on the right track. And we fought for more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids to complete year 12, and you're already there. This is your turn. Those of us who are 18, changes and stuff that we've been talking about tonight, it's this generation's turn to run at it and make changes. So you're in a really good place to take up the cudgel or the fighting stick that was given, it's a kudra, that was given to Megan by the Anangu people at Mutijulu. That's what you need, a big woman's fighting stick.
So that was a wonderful example of a young woman who is going to remember that moment for her life.
I hope so. She's super smart.
Well, and she's going to. And I think one of the things that you've already given us a sense of is the powerful women in your lives, your mothers, for a start. I'm wondering, as powerful women today, are there other women who have really made a big difference in helping shape the people you are, who've helped you on the journey that you've been over the years?
Well, apart from my mum, I had a very strong Auntie Judy. I used to go to her place Christmas holidays and things. That's where I learnt to play the piano and other things like that. So she had a huge impact on my upbringing. I also had really fantastic English teachers that I remember, female English teachers, some that I still keep in contact with. I loved all my teachers though. And then there's been, obviously a lot of women since I moved to Sydney. Well, I should mention my sister because she gets annoyed every time James is shaking his head. Every time I forget, I don't forget about her. She's just such a central part of my life, but I have got in trouble a few times for not mentioning her, but she's had a really a tremendous impact. Of course, she's my little sister, right? She's the kind of keeper of the culture and the keeper of our songs and the keeper of our stories. She's who you go to. I went straight back to her after Uluru. We were so tired and exhausted and a bit disoriented. And so she got in contact with our elders and we went up to the Bunya Mountains and had a nice, weekend away just to kind of contemplate, what had happened there and what we'd been doing for 2 years. And then there's been a lot of, incredible mentors over the years. I mean, one's in the audience, she'll hate me singling her out, but Dr. Sarah Pritchard, SC's in the audience. I met her for the first time at the United Nations when I was a kid, and she was the first person that kind of, well, for one, she kind of paid attention to me in a very nice and respectful way and taught me the UN system and taught me a lot about international law and about the drafting of the declaration that I was there doing as a junior ATSIC lawyer. And so she was super generous with her time and explaining to me lots of things about public international law that I hadn't learnt yet at UQ. And I think having that kind of, on-the-ground experience is incredible. And I also worked with Sarah during the expert panel on constitutional recognition. She was the chief writer on that report. So she's always been a massive influence in terms of my life. Her and her husband are like a second family in Sydney since I have such a big family. I've lived away from home for so long. And another female mentor would be Hilary Charlesworth, who was my supervisor. I did my masters at ANU, working with you actually when I was a kid, catching the Murray's bus up and down for my courses, $30 return, to ANU to study under her. That's why I went. And then it took me ages to work up the courage to ask her to supervise me, and she said yes. And she had a most profound impact upon my thinking, particularly around law reform. And I did my doctorate under her. So there's so many women, that impact or have a huge impact upon the life over the years. Of course, working with Auntie Pat has been life-changing, really. I've learned a lot from Auntie Pat. Working with Auntie Pat and Noel closely, I've learned a lot about female leadership.
And Pat, when it comes to when it comes to female leadership, I mean, it's really noticeable with the Uluru Statement, the role that women have played in that. I mean, are we seeing a shift in this area, or really is it we haven't noticed the women who are playing these roles and have been for many years? I mean, is your sense anything has changed?
I think women largely go unnoticed. I mean, I think the NAIDOC theme this year, because of Her We Can, I think it's just captured everybody's imagination, and not only amongst Aboriginal people in the Torres Strait Islander, but the whole nation. So for the first time, a theme for NAIDOC has really captured everybody, and it's been a wonderful celebration of women. And the sort of, so I think women generally go a little bit unnoticed and acknowledged publicly, because they're the backbone of all the families, and certainly growing up at prep camp, because the women who are the biggest influence on me, apart from my mother, all the women that lived at prep camp that my mother grew up with at Carlin Compound, because when she was stolen and taken off her lands, they took her to Carlin Compound in Darwin. So all those kids that were there from all over the territory and in further, they all grew each other up. So there was a very tight bond. So I know those women and those families, or some of them have gone now, like my mum, but their children and their children's children were still a very sort of tight group of people. So the influence of those women managed. They were so resilient and so tough and loving and compassionate, and they were really, really good role models in keeping their families together. So they've been a big influence, and there's been a whole myriad of women, contemporary Aboriginal. Megan here, and Sonia, there's lots and lots of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women around the country. Lois O'Donoghue and Pat Turner and June Oscar from all over the country. So the theme, because of Her We Can at NATO, gave us permission to celebrate the wonderful contribution that women make to their families, to the society, and indeed to the nation state.
Thanks, Pat. And Megan, talking about the great influences upon life, it would be remiss of us not to mention rugby league, at least at some point in this conversation. And certainly if anyone follows Megan's Twitter feed, it's an intriguing blend of constitutional law, international law and grassroots rugby league matches. And quite unlike any other, I think, Twitter feed. What is it about rugby league? What is it about your past that makes this such a passion for you?
Yeah, go on. I'm curious.
Rugby league was a huge impact upon the dialogues too. Our whole routine revolved around the NRL draw. I'm not joking, hey? Rugby league's like a huge part of Aboriginal culture. I mean, I don't remember it not being a big part of it.
And that's more so than other sports?
Well, I come from southeast Queensland, southwest Queensland. That's just the sport. And it's pretty much the same in New South Wales. I mean, one of the important things about rugby league is that it arrived on a lot of the missions and reserves not long after it arrived in Australia from England in 1908. And I've done probably too much archival research about from the Queensland State Library about its arrival on the reserves and missions. And so it played a really important role, and particularly if I just talk about Queensland, given that was the kind of epicentre of the frontier wars, or the killing times. It was the one way when you look through the files and you look through the permits and the letters, it was one of the ways that Aboriginal men could leave a mission or reserve and go and play in rugby league teams with other, white men, and socialise and play against other teams. It's really fascinating to, again, do the research and look at some of the draws and look who's winning and look at who's, the way that the newspapers used to write about some of the really great players, like Frank Fisher from Cherbourg, for example. I am fascinated in that emancipatory role that rugby league played. At least in terms of Queensland and New South Wales, and certainly, so then when you go to the Murray carnivals up north, the rugby league carnivals, and you go to the Koori knockouts, like a lot of the teams are based on they're based on the former missions and reserves, or what are townships and places where people live now, and so it's very deeply ingrained in our culture, and I just don't remember it not being a part of my life. My father and his brothers and a lot of my uncles and grandfather were involved in the creation of the one of the first all-black teams in Hervey Bay, where they all grew up, and have always played there. And then when I joined the Australian Rugby League Commission, I got really just incredibly moving emails and text messages from, incredible rugby league administrators, like the former, he's now the CEO of the Titans, but former CEOs of the Broncos, Dennis Watts, about playing with my uncles and about, he was very moved by the things that I'd said about the impact of rugby league in a lot of communities in Queensland and the role it's played in reconciliation, I suppose, for want of a better word.
And so, Megan, one of the other key threads in your life is the law, of course, whether it be going back to your studies, through ATSIC, to your work at the University of New South Wales, internationally representing Australia and your peoples at the UN. What is it that keeps drawing you back to the law as well? What is it about the law that you see as so significant and so powerful that means that you really immerse yourself in that through your career?
I suppose, well, one of the things in the dialogues that we used to talk to the mob about was this notion of the force of law. You know, we'd spend a few days talking to people about Aboriginal law and white law and about issues of sovereignty and all of their concerns in relation to structural reform, or what people call constitutional recognition. And so we would talk about how one of the things you know white fellas do is to use the force of law to compel governments and states to do things, because often humans don't just do things out of the kindness of their hearts. You have to compel people to do it for good reason. And so part of talking about constitutional reform was about talking about how you can use the law to compel government to listen. And I think because post-ATSIC, you know, we've had 15 years of just now a very, very run-down area of law and policy, a very neglected area where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices aren't listened to at many levels. There are kind of there are committees and those kinds of things, but government's not compelled to listen or to consult at all. I think that was what was really, I think, key for us in conveying the importance of law reform, and that's why I joined your centre and enjoyed public law and constitutional law so much, because of the ways in which you can use constitutions to compel governments to listen to communities that aren't communities that will get them re-elected, or communities that they might not like for whatever reason, whether it's prejudice or... and we're a very small numbered vulnerable community who really requires structural reform to ensure that we can have an active role in the democratic life of the state. So there is that, and of course one of the things, and it's still going on in relation to law reform, at least in this area, was something Hilary always taught me about, the important role that imagination plays in the law. That in order to achieve reform, you have to imagine that the world can be better, and you have to imagine that things can change. So when we went out to communities, they were very, at first, reluctant to engage. They were very angry, and we had to really spend a fair bit of time talking to them about law reform and saying, you know, just because the government hasn't listened for the past 3 decades doesn't mean, that's exaggerated, but maybe 15 years, doesn't mean that's always going to be the case, but for us to get the kind of constitutional reform that we want, you have to, you know, can you please walk through this process with us, and we'll see if we can achieve what you think is a meaningful form of recognition.
And Pat, I mean, your life has intersected with the law in many ways as well. You talk about your family, your mother, the law prohibiting her getting an education, and the circumstances of your childhood. You were the sonographer for the Woodrow Royal Commission. Of course, you were very much involved in the Little Children of Sacred report, which was a good example of the Commonwealth in the end using its own coercive powers in an entirely different way from what you were recommending. And I wonder, all of that, why did you take up that position as co-chair of the Referendum Council, which was... You need a lot of hope to think actually things could be different, particularly from what you saw in the Northern Territory with the intervention. So why did you accept that challenge?
The intervention was a big betrayal. There's no doubt about that. And the opportunity there, once again, was lost to try to make some structural change and reform here for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids in the Northern Territory in particular. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, the law. It hasn't always worked very well for us. And I went with the... I decided that I would take up, because I was offered just to be on the committee. I wasn't offered the to be a co-chair, that happened when Patrick Dodson took up the offer to go into to the Senate. So I didn't sign up to be the chair. I was very happy just being on the committee. I didn't think I was going to sort of lead this. But the reason, anyhow, that aside, the reason why I decided to take up the offer to be part of it was that, you know, I've spent my lifetime in this space trying to affect change, and all of us have. We've sat on committees, we've sat on panels, we've been part of reports, we've been of committees, we've been this group, that group, hoping that you can convince or educate for change. Sometimes it happens a little bit, but mostly it doesn't. Or it's so almost, change is almost indiscernible. So I thought the only way, because I've done this myself, and some of us too, have even compromised ourselves a little bit, hoping that we could make some gain with some law or some reform if we went down this road. Often it never happens. So for me, being involved has been a whole series, been a monumental disappointment because it hasn't worked. Anyhow, when this came along, I thought there's only one way to make change here, is to go for structural reform, the sorts of reforms, so we can get locked in to the Constitution. So we've set up many bodies, as you will know. There's a whole lot of initiatives that we've made. We've been talking about this since about 1788. We started in 1820 with some of the things. What we're hearing now, people have been saying this since 1820, and it's well documented. None of this, for the Prime Minister to say it's all new, it's from left field bullshit. We've been saying this like forever. How dare he? How dare he? You know, so it's nothing is new. In fact, William Cooper talked about a voice to Parliament in the 1820s, and there were people before him talking about it. It's not Noel Pearson's idea. He researched and found out these people have been saying this for a long time. So I thought I'm going to have one more run at this, and that was to change the Constitution. They can lock us in there, so as they can't, we set up a committee or set up like NAC, NAEC, even the big ATSIC. A minister decided that they were out of favour. Look, ATSIC had problems, but it was being reviewed at the time, and the minister of the day couldn't even wait for the report to be handed down. She decided that's it, so she signed it away. And that's what they've been doing to us, like, forever. So the only way now, and I just want to endorse what Megan said. When we went out and started talking to people, people are really had enough. They've absolutely had enough of all of this long-time treatment of us, and there had to be structural reform. And people are in pain. Communities and families are really hurting. So we had to come up with something that was going to make a real difference. So I like the idea of having a run at changing the Constitution so we can be locked in there without giving up anything, without having, excuse me, I know this is the law faculty, but we didn't want to put too many words in the Constitution so that a generation of lawyers would fiddle with every word. So we steered away from that. So we just came up with some big things that they could do, so to try to eliminate or cut that down as much as possible, because the law and us hasn't always, there's not been a good relationship at all. But I took up that offer because I thought I'd have one more run at this, and that's the only thing that was left to us. We've sat on so many committees. We've bounced our asses off the moon. It hasn't made a blind bit of difference. So that's why I decided to go and be part of the referendum council. But now, of course, the Prime Minister won't even let us have a conversation.
We call for the establishment of First Nation voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nation and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country, we invite you to walk with us in a movement of Australian people for a better future.
Megan, these were powerful words that we see on the Uluru Statement here, and you brought that to Canberra, you met with the Prime Minister, you met with the opposition leader. Can you tell us a little bit about the response you got from Australia's leaders to this historic process, these dialogues that had gone around the country, and how you responded to the rejection that you received?
It's difficult to explain. It didn't go down very well. The initial response was that we'd stuffed up, that we'd overreached our terms of reference, that what did the Prime Minister say? A bird in the hand. So we obviously had lots of problems with the fact that a lot of politicians and their advisors don't actually pay attention to a lot or read a lot. And so in this space, I think they earnestly thought that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people wanted a symbolic form of recognition.
Yeah, just some
And
poetry.
how could they think that? Because yourself and Pat and others have for years said that's not the case. How do you think that there could be such a disconnect between the Uluru Statement and what Indigenous leaders have been saying and what apparently they thought you actually wanted?
I think it's partly, and I mean, Trump and Auntie Pat, but I think partly it's related to the voice. They listened to a lot of a particular, I suppose, urban elite voice who have access to Parliament, who perhaps were saying that symbolism would be fine. So it might have been that, in terms of other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people saying, yeah, that's what, because we used to hear, I know the mob want to go now, they don't care what it is. And, we'd be like, actually they do. I mean, if you just followed Aboriginal media, you would see that there was a huge, and social media, but let's not go there, there was huge backlash for a number of years against the Recognise campaign and against recognition in general. I'm not sure, I think part of it is the referendum, the actual amendment provision in the Constitution. I think there's this calculation, quite a crude and unsophisticated calculation among both parties, that because of the 8 of the 44 amendments, the 8 had bipartisan support, and therefore the only thing that mattered in this process was that there was bipartisan support. So then it was just a race to the lowest common denominator.
Just had to fall in line with whatever that was.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
And so we had to, part of Uluru was saying that a recognition was a transaction. There was the recognise all, the Australian people, and then there's the what's called the to be recognised, or the First Nations, and that you can't do a recognition process unless the First Nations agree to what the model was. And if you have a look at the Referendum Council report, of course, the notion, and we were vindicated on this point, the notion that people were going to accept a statement of acknowledgement in the Constitution just didn't get up at any of the dialogues, except for in a kind of different kind of way at Ross River. But so the reaction wasn't good, and people, there was a month before Uluru and the release of the report, and journalists, many who should know better, politicians who probably don't, they didn't wait for the report either, so they didn't wait to see what had happened, so there was that gap in information. And then when it was released, we had that day a very frosty meeting with the government and opposition. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Okay, it was frosty. All of those meetings were frosty. I just believe they never bothered to really read it and try and get their head around it. Now, Labor absolutely has come around to it, and that's really important, and that's been a lot of work, I think, in working with Labor to understand what happened. But of course, the obviously it was pretty devastating, the leak from Cabinet that they were going to reject it outright. And I tell this story about Dylan Leno won the Federation Prize, book prize for his book on constitutional recognition, and we were driving to the book launch here on level, somewhere, the common room on level 2, and as we were driving, Noel was on the radio. It was on Patricia just railing against the Prime Minister. And Gemma McKinnon's going to kill me for singling her out, but Gemma was driving, and we had to pull over because she just burst into tears. She was so devastated. And we just had phone calls from all of these young people that we'd brought along with us who were just sobbing, because they'd never participated in something like that, and they'd never seen the government reject something so ruthlessly without giving us an opportunity to debate it and discuss it with the Australian people. And Auntie Pat, I remember saying to you and Noel the next day on a teleconference that I always thought of myself as a constitutional lawyer in this process, working with you and Noel and everybody. But that's the first time that I thought, well, that's what leadership is. Like we'd invited all these kids on this journey, these young people on this journey with us, to experience the dialogues, to experience the region, to run things, to see what dialogue looks like. And then at the end, I just wasn't expecting that, Pat, that of course they were devastated, but I wasn't expecting to have to deal with that.
And one last question, Pat, before we open it up to the audience. Pat, the call for voice, treaty, truth that's in the Uluru Statement, you talked about joining the Referendum Council, having hope that, this would be the throw of the dice that would entrench something that would compel action. And there's been a remarkable job to make sure, in the face of the rejection by the Prime Minister, that this debate is very much alive. There's a parliamentary committee, there's all sorts of things there. But what hope do you have that this can still be realised, given the challenges that you've seen over many decades in securing support from politicians for change?
On a good day, I'm still hopeful, because I think Australia's ready for change. And since Uluru, since the release of our report, there's been a whole range of people who've been in touch from all walks of life, been in touch with us, and different groups have set themselves up. Because we were right in giving the Uluru Statement not to the Prime Minister, not to the politicians, but to the people of Australia. And that's the only way we're going to win this, is for all of you and everybody you know and the people that they know to have a people's movement. That's the only way. And I think this is probably a good time to do that. These last 10, 15 years in Aboriginal affairs has just been appalling. It's been absolutely appalling. So there has to be change, and there's just no leadership in the country. I think there's a state of envy, and I don't think that speech yesterday in Parliament from that man. My heart sank, I have to say. And how dare he go into our Parliament and talk like that? So that's a low point. And they're out there. We all know they're out there. But I think the only way, and I still have hope, that through more and more Australians standing up for this, that's the only way that we can make any real inroads here and make change, because it's your document. It's not the government of the day. It belongs to us. And we say what's in it and what isn't in it, not them. And that's where my hope lies, with you all, with the Australian public.
Thank you. Sean. So now, Sean, do we have some roving mics in the audience for some questions?
Thank you to you both, or three of you, but particularly the two of you. My name is Peter Sainsbury. I was here last night for Bob Brown, who gave a talk on the environment. And he was equally passionate as the two of you about a slightly different topic. But all three of you, all three of you have been not too guardedly critical of politicians and our democracy at present. So I wonder what hope you have fundamentally of achieving political change, when I share the view that, politics is pretty crooked in this country. I don't mean necessarily corrupt in that sense. I mean crooked in the sense of not being very good. And our system isn't able to respond to the major challenges that are facing Australia at this time. I just wonder if you've got any comments on how we change our democratic system to do better.
I think only you can change it. Politicians do what they do because they're politicians by their very nature. The inherentness of being a politician, that's what they do. However, they're only there because we've put them there. So that responsibility of change, I think the buck stops with us. I don't know, maybe that I'm being politically naive here, but that's the system, and I think the system needs to be used. And I think Australia, maybe we're a little bit lazy, about some of this stuff, that it's too hard. But I think we need to run at this because I really do despair for the level of intellectualism in our country today. It's all there, but they're not the people who are making the decisions, and that's a real worry, I reckon.
I think there's two things. I think we have had an overwhelming response in terms of the Uluru Statement, but partially because we've issued it to the Australian people and we didn't hand it over. Like, we refused to give it to Parliament House or any institution. We don't want them to be wheeling out. So after Uluru, we went to the Q&A and they wheeled out the bark petition and every petition they could find. And they never, it's so ritualistic. They accept it, they hang it up, it looks really great. But we're still left with the same situation. But I think Pat's right. I think there's a little bit of passivity in the Australian population in relation to sometimes using their political power and voice to be able to make change. And some political scientists say that that's connected to things like compulsory voting. It means people will vote, and that's their big, political statement, and perhaps do less then. I don't know. I know that successive civic studies have shown that in understanding tenets of liberal democratic governance, that Australian students fare really poorly on ways of influencing the political system outside of the ballot box. So one of the things that has had a really important impact is just simply Aussies going and seeing their local member, because that's what we need. We need people in numbers influencing and impacting upon those swinging seats and those die-hard Liberal seats. And we've heard, because as George said, they rejected it outright, but it was placed back in the terms of reference for the Joint Select Committee. So that was pressure from a lot of the leadership, but also we're told pressure from micro-polling, like Liberal voters are raising it. Why did you just reject it outright? I mean, there's no sense to not allowing an open, transparent public debate about it and just saying that, it was inconsistent with Australia's liberal democratic traditions. I mean, it's just total nonsense and no one bought it. So there's been a little bit, there's been an overwhelming response, but on the flip side, there's been people saying, what are you going to do to get the Uluru Statement up? Like, what are you doing? What are blackfellas going to do? Blackfellas have to stay united, blackfellas have to do this, blackfellas have to do that. But the whole purpose of that was that, we can't do this on our own at all.
We don't have the numbers.
We don't have the numbers. And it's a fair reform. Like, if you read it and you read the Referendum Council report, this is, as Auntie Pat said, none of this is new. So really, a lot of what came up in the dialogues and at Uluru is what people have been asking for decades. But these are the structural reforms that a sample of First Nations representatives from across the country in a deliberative dialogue process has said is the roadmap forward. It is pretty modest, it's reasonable, it's utterly consistent with our democratic traditions and constitutional traditions. We're smart enough to work with constitutional lawyers of all colours to ensure that it was a robust proposal. So really, the key thing is the statement is kind of the statement that sits on the top of the 18-page Uluru Statement document. It's a lengthy one that gives an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander version of Australian history. It's a very beautiful history. And then it explains the key reforms, voice, treaty, truth. And we just need, non-Indigenous Australia to really engage with this. And if they're going to do one thing in terms of their entire lifetime, in terms of political activism, we really need them to go to their local member and push for this first step. It's a sequence reform, and push for this. Help us push to move to a referendum, because as Auntie Pat said, it's our constitution. We're the ones who can change it. And the last thing I'll say is that we keep saying to mob, don't give up, because the system is meant to change. Liberal democratic governance, our public institutions and the constitution, they're set up to change. They're meant to reform. But to get there, we exercised some imagination, and we got to an end point. Finally, after 8 years, we know what meaningful recognition is. And now we just need help from Australians to get to the other side.
Yes, Sir Anthony down the front here.
As you travel around the Aboriginal communities in Australia and you discuss with them and with their representatives important issues, constitutional recognition being the most important of them, do you find the views expressed in the communities are more or less uniform, or do you find that they vary considerably?
So to get to constitutional reform, we had to build in an entire day of discussions about the other things, which was useful for two reasons. It would settle people down for the deliberative dialogue the next day, but then we could also use really nuanced information about the region to help us explain the constitutional reforms. But in terms of what people were saying, I would say it was universal. There are documents from each of the regions, you can see. So there will be differences in that, say in the Kimberley, they spoke a lot about unsealed roads, about lengthy distances, about cost of fresh food, and then of course the Torres Strait or Brisbane, they'd all have kind of different regional differences. But you started to see a commonality around the breakdown in communication between local government, state government, federal government, hearing the most ridiculous duplication of powers in places like Far North Queensland, well, all of them, right? So you started to hear just in that first day really big structural problems in terms of the federal system, how it communicates with each other, but also so post the abolition of ATSIC and with the introduction of a new policy called the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which the Australian National Audit Office actually vindicated everything people were saying in the dialogues last year. You started to see the breakdown of communities entirely in terms of having any autonomy over decision-making and programs and public money. And so I would say there was, although people would express it differently, of course. So Ross River, for example, was a very powerful dialogue in Central Australia run by the Central Land Council, where we had 3 interpreters and 3 different languages plus English. So the constitutional element took 6 hours rather than 2. And so the way that they talked about things and the language they used was different, but they were by and large still talking about the same structural problems. Yeah. And that's how I think Section 116A fell away in terms of a non-discrimination clause in the Constitution, and that's how a voice to Parliament became more prominent. So even though it wasn't an entrenched or enshrined right in the Constitution, even if Aboriginal people couldn't veto the Parliament because of parliamentary sovereignty, the power of that kind of upfront political empowerment was important to people. So there was a massive shift between the expert panel's report and recommendations and then the referendum council. Yeah.
Just got a question there. Thank you.
My question sort of carries on from the gentleman's statement. My grandfather and my great-grandfather were signatories on the Treaty of Waitangi. They actually signed the treaty, but there were a lot of chiefs that didn't. And the reason is because all the tribes didn't agree on these changes that were going to be made by the white people. So my question is, do you think that there's a sort of division between the tribes as to which way it should go, or between your mobs, as to which way it should go? Because it's a really huge thing to bring together.
Yep.
And also, if the governments are a problem, then why can't we get Indigenous peoples into the local governments and the, federal governments?
Yeah. So the second question first. So we did discuss different ways in which you can participate in the political system. And we talked about Māori reserve seats, designated parliamentary seats. That wasn't an option that, that we'd got permission from the Prime Minister or opposition leader to take out, although it was discussed in the dialogues. So people were interested, of course, and have always been with reserve seats, but people also distinguished, or people discussed the fact that reserve seats or designated parliamentary seats would still mean that the Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people who take those seats would inevitably be subject to the power of party discipline. So the power of party discipline and the role that party discipline plays in Liberal democratic governance today was very prominent in those conversations about reserved seats, or even having Aboriginal people or Indigenous people in either party running and being senators. So we know that Patrick and Linda, their first allegiance is to the ALP when it comes to those kinds of parliamentary deliberations. So on the first point, I think part of the design of the dialogues was a nod to the fact that it's always difficult. I mean, you never expect any community to be universal, 100% on board with everything. So we understand, acutely understand the point that you're making around people disagreeing or not agreeing with particular reforms. So the dialogues were designed in a way to kind of accommodate that. What we are saying is that now that we've got what we think is the closest you can get to what First Nations think is meaningful constitutional or structural reform, the next phase would be running another series of dialogues to ask, as particularly because this voice is a First Nations voice, so it's an unusual model in the world in that the nation would, rather than ATSIC, which was a very typical Western Liberal democratic structure, a ballot box structure where individuals could run. And part of the dialogues was privileged in that 60% of invites were to traditional owners. So it's very much about returning decision-making on really important matters back to the cultural authority around the country. We think that there needs to be another round of dialogues with First Nations to have that conversation about what this voice to Parliament would look like. We've started some of those informal dialogues or conversations with traditional owners and other people about what the voice might look like. And again, just getting more nuanced information about the ways in which local, state and governments operate in particular areas. But it is the case that if there are First Nations that want to opt out of that body, then they will be able to opt out of that body. But what we do want to do is get as near a consensus as we possibly can on what people think this body should look like. And look, we were able to do that with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. That was something like 8 months of consultations with communities around Australia on what they wanted as a public institution. And so I think we will follow a kind of similar process to try and achieve that and allow traditional owners and allow communities to design what this voice to Parliament looks like.
Thanks, Meg. We've got time for one more question. Yes, we've got a question here.
Noah Bedford. I'm a young Wiradjuri boy. My question is, following such a swift rejection from Prime Minister Turnbull and the heartbreak amongst the young generations of blackfellas that ensued, what I found most tragic was that whilst it was so swift, it almost was also without political consequence. And what scares me about that is that until, or what I thought to be the reason for that was that until we can start postulating about the forms of representation or rights of Indigenous people that should be held or contained within our national document, I feel as though we haven't yet gone through a process of the Australian people kind of reckoning with the moral and ethical obligations that they owe to Indigenous Australia. Given that, Auntie Pat, you spoke so much about the importance of getting white Australia on board, how do you think that we can facilitate or compel conversations around a reckoning with Australia's history and the moral obligation that Australia owes to Indigenous people as a very important step to ensuring that they'd be willing to support major structural reforms to our guiding document?
I think that's the importance. Thank you for your question. That's the importance, of the Makarrata process, which would be, and part of that is the truth telling. So the nation, so we can have some bloodletting here, and people will be better able to understand what we say, and how we do things. That hasn't happened in this country. I think one of the problems with the Reconciliation Australia brief, if you like, it sort of came at the wrong end. There was we were supposed to reconcile, but there was no truth telling. There was no process before that. So it would be very good if a lot of those millions of dollars was actually spent on having a national conversation, and each party, if you like, telling their truth, so there could be some real reconciliation and some healing, so we can then move to the next stage. So that's why we were really clear, people said from the regional dialogues, that there needed to be a truth-telling process. Now, we don't need a constitutional change for that. We can do that tomorrow if we wanted to. So there has to be a healing process before we can proceed in terms of healing the nation and healing all of our hearts. But we can't even have a conversation about any of this with this current government the way that it is. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop saying and doing and I think if each of us sort of went to their local member and started harassing and hounding them, maybe there would be some change. But it's really, really important, treaty and the truth-telling and the Makarrata. So that's that whole reason why people talked about that at length and very poetically in just about every dialogue we went to. I think probably one of the most memorable ones was the talking about that and the truth-telling and the stories. For instance, there's a big statue in Alice Springs to the explorer that went through the country there and put up, Stewart or Sturt? Stewart. The telegraph line up from South Australia to the Northern Territory, and there's a really big statue of this white man on a horseback, and he's got a gun. So the people that pass this statue every day, it was their families that were killed by this man with the gun. So how insensitive is that to have these statues? And they're all over the country. So we need to come to terms with some of this and sort it out. Let's do the bloodletting. So thank you for your question, because that's the whole purpose for having the truth-telling. But like I say, we don't need a constitutional change for that. We can do that if we want it, if there's political will. And there isn't at the moment.
Sure.
Well, thank you for your questions, and thank you, George, for conducting the conversation, and in particular, my deep gratitude to Pat and to Megan for such a fascinating and enriching conversation about your own journeys and also this critically important issue for the future of our country and particularly for its First Nations peoples. So Pat and Megan, please accept a small gift from us.
Pat's excited.
Present as well. Thank you, Sean.
Very happy.
And thank you. You got in ahead of me in inviting you to thank Pat and Megan yourselves. Also, thanks to George. And I wanted to quickly record my thanks to a range of terrific colleagues and others who've helped with this event. Megan Danielle and Diane from the Division of External Relations at the University, and our colleagues in Alumni Engagement and Development, Nikki Jacobs, Catherine Brown and Rebecca Freed, Ken, our photographer, Bruce, the videographer, Zeph and Ash, our AV technicians, Laura and Gemma, Laura Hunter and Gemma McKinnon in Megan's office, Perina and Christina in Pat's office at the Lowitja Institute. Many centre and faculty colleagues, including particularly tonight, Lindsay, Christian, Harry, Jemima and Joffe. And a particular thanks to the administrator for the Gilbert and Tobin Centre, Tom Chapman, and the law school's marketing manager, Amy Stanley, for their fantastic professionalism and really wholehearted support for the event. Finally, thank you all for attending and participating in tonight's event, and thank you and good evening.